Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take your stack of sources, extract the knowledge you need, and deliver the most surprising connections, giving you the shortcut to being truly well-informed.
Today we are taking on, well, a pretty epic analysis of legal history. We're talking about a journey that spans over 1,300 years.
It's incredible. We're going from a 7th century battlefield all the way to a modern constitutional court.
All to uncover this remarkable, and I think for many people, a totally forgotten lineage of environmental protection.
That's exactly right. And the mission for this deep dive is really to shatter a common misconception. I think most of us, when we think of environmental law, our minds immediately jump to, the 1970s.
The classic images: smog over cities, rivers on fire, the birth of the first environmental protection agencies.
Right. We see it as this purely modern thing, a necessity born out of the tragedies of the Industrial Revolution.
But the sources you sent over, they reveal something far more profound. This core ethical framework for protecting the planet. This idea that nature is a kind of trust. It didn't start 50 years ago.
Not even close. It was codified over a millennium ago.
It's wild.
So today, we're synthesizing some really incredible material. We're comparing 3 completely distinct legal moments. First, a foundational historical instruction from the first Caliph, Abu Bakr.
Then we jump forward to the 20th century global legislative response, the EPAs of the world.
And we land on a landmark constitutional ruling from the Pakistani Supreme Court in 1994.
And what makes this comparison so powerful, I think, is seeing how these vastly different systems, we're talking military ethics, secular regulation, and constitutional law, all somehow converge on the exact same fundamental principle.
Which is?
That the health of the environment is completely inseparable from human justice and human dignity.
That's the core theme, isn't it? This big transition in thinking. From viewing the natural world as just a pile of resources to be consumed.
To recognizing it as a public trust.
Yeah.
A shared inheritance that we hold for the benefit of everyone, including, and this is key, people who aren't even born yet.
And that idea of public trust is our launch pad today.
It really is. And here's the thing that's so fascinating, the real the intellectual shock factor for me. The earliest, most comprehensive environmental code we have on record didn't come from a peace treaty or some civil committee.
No.
It came from the ultimate instrument of potential destruction, military instructions, given to an army right before an invasion.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because we have to start not in the halls of Congress, but in the military encampments of the 7th century with Caliph Abu Bakr.
Let's do it.
So let's set the scene. We're talking around the year 634 CE. This is a period of intense political and military change right after the passing of the Prophet Muhammad.
Right. And Abu Bakr, as-Siddiq, as the first caliph, is in the process of dispatching this massive army north into Syria.
And in that context, you'd expect the orders to be, purely military.
Yeah.
Strategy, supply lines, how to deal with enemy combatants, the usual rules of war for that period.
Which at the time were pretty brutal. The prevailing logic was often about total victory, crippling the enemy's ability to fight back in the future.
Scorched earth was a legitimate tactic.
Absolutely. But the commands Abu Bakr delivered went, light years beyond that. The sources are really clear on this. This specific set of instructions is unique in recorded history for its scope. It's considered the earliest written example of a truly comprehensive environmental and humanitarian law.
I think the biggest takeaway for me, right off the bat, is that this mandate was about conduct during war. War, which by its very nature is destructive, was suddenly being constrained by ecological stewardship.
It's a total paradigm shift. It wasn't just about winning at all costs anymore. It was about defining the absolute limits of power, even military power, against the natural world.
A moral red line.
A moral red line, exactly. And the specificity is what makes this so powerful. This isn't just some vague ethical advice. Let's walk through the 5 key prohibitions he gave, because it's fascinating how they move from the human to the natural world so seamlessly.
Okay, so the commands start with a clear humanitarian baseline. He says, do not kill women, children, the elderly, or monks.
Crucial. Establishes protection for non-combatants right away. But then, immediately after, the commands create what is essentially an ecological protection zone, even inside enemy territory.
This is the mind-blowing part. The environmental mandate follows. The first prohibition is, do not cut trees.
Simple, direct.
The second, do not burn crops.
Third, do not harm animals except for food. And then it comes full circle, tying it all together. Do not destroy places of worship.
Let's just pause on those. Do not cut trees. I mean, that's a sweeping ban on deforestation as a military tactic. Do not burn crops. That's a direct prohibition of scorched earth policies, which protects the food supply and the soil itself for generations.
This mandate 1,300 years ago is effectively a codified environmental protection law. It's treating natural capital, the trees, the soil, the animals, as inviolable.
And the political weight of this can't be understated. This wasn't, a friendly suggestion. It set a standard of accountability and placed limits on the most powerful arm of the state, the military.
It just forces you to ask the question, what was the legal and ethical thinking behind this? Why did he put the palm groves on the same level of protection as the elderly and the monks?
Well, it clearly wasn't just utilitarian. It wasn't save the crops so our army can eat them later. It was a statement about their inherent value.
That's it. And when we look at the legal analysis in the sources, it all comes down to his core conceptualization of what natural resources are.
Right. And what was that?
The foundation, rooted in Islamic jurisprudence, was that everything, the trees, rivers, crops, animals, air, was not private property to be seized or military property to be destroyed. They were seen as a public trust, a gift from the Creator held in stewardship by humanity for the benefit of all. The Arabic term is amana.
A trust. And as soon as you frame it as a trust instead of a commodity, the entire legal dynamic changes.
Everything changes. It immediately imposes duties and creates rights. You can't just destroy something you only hold in trust for someone else, in this case for God and for future generations.
So let's dig into the legal principles that the sources trace back to this one idea. There are 5 of them, and they are shockingly modern.
They really are. They define the ethical limits of the state's power. So first, it implicitly created environmental rights. The right of the community, present and future, to a functioning ecosystem was now protected.
Second, it established clear public welfare duties. The common good, which included ecological stability, was placed above narrow, short-term military goals.
Third, and this is radical for the 7th century, it imposed strict limits on military power. It said that even in the middle of a war, there are entire systems, natural systems, that are off limits.
Fourth, it mandated the protection of future generations. By preserving the productive capacity of the land, the trees, the crops, the law ensured that resources would still be there for the people who came after the war was over.
And fifth, maybe most importantly for law, it demanded accountability for ecological harm. If you broke this code, you were responsible for that injustice.
And that accountability principle isn't just theoretical. It makes the code feel real, not just philosophical. Which brings us to that incredible anecdote from the sources, the burning palm trees incident.
Yes, this is the anchor detail.
Yeah.
This is what proves it wasn't just a nice speech, but that it was enforced immediately and seriously, even out on the battlefield.
So what happened?
A commander, probably following the standard military playbook of the era, burned down an enemy's palm grove. Maybe to demoralize them, maybe to deny them resources. It was a classic tactical move.
Makes sense from a purely military perspective.
It does. But when word of this got back to Abu Bakr, his response wasn't a commendation for tactical cleverness. It was a swift, sharp, moral condemnation.
He wasn't just giving him a slap on the wrist.
No. He asked a question that, it still gives me chills. The sources quote him as saying, "Do you punish the innocent earth for the actions of men? No tree shall be cut unless necessity demands."
Punish the innocent earth. Wow. That phrasing changes everything. It elevates the environment to the status of a third party in the conflict, an innocent bystander.
Precisely. It shifts environmental destruction from being a strategic mistake to being a profound moral injustice. The earth itself is innocent, and harming it is a crime in and of itself, regardless of whether it helps you win a battle.
And this shows that even without a modern EPA or a court system, a strong, centralized ethical authority could immediately enforce this principle.
The core idea was firmly established. Environment is part of justice. If the environment is violated, then justice has not been served. Full stop.
Which is the critical transition point for us. This incredibly sophisticated codified protection existed in the 7th century. It recognized concepts like inherent value, public trust, intergenerational equity, centuries and centuries ahead of its time.
So the big question becomes, why did the rest of the world take 1,300 years and require multiple colossal tragedies to finally catch up?
That is the question. Missing millennium, what happened?
It's a complex answer, but we have to touch on it before we jump to the 20th century. For centuries, especially in the West, environmental law would basically just property rights.
Right. If you think about Western legal traditions, especially leading up to the Industrial Revolution, the dominant view was that property rights were almost absolute. The environment was something to be conquered, owned, and exploited for profit.
Exactly. You contrast Abu Bakr's concept of public trust with the Western legal concept of dominium, which is absolute ownership.
Yeah.
Under that framework, if I own the land, I can cut the trees, I can mine the minerals, I can pollute the stream, as long as I don't directly interfere with my neighbor's specific property rights.
So, under that system, you could maybe sue a factory for the smoke damaging your specific farm under nuisance law, but you couldn't sue the factory for just polluting the air in general.
Because clean air wasn't seen as a fundamental public right. It wasn't a trust that belonged to everyone. And that's the massive philosophical gap. The ancient code protected the environment for its own sake.
But the problem outgrew the mechanism, right? The industrial era began, and the scale of human impact just exploded. One caliph's rebuke of a single commander couldn't stand up against the industrial output of thousands of factories.
The principle got buried under the pressures of global industrialization, which prioritized unlimited growth. It took the unbelievable tragedies of the 20th century, catastrophes that affected millions of people in big cities, to prove that environmental neglect wasn't just a moral failing.
It was a massive threat to public health and national stability.
The world needed that crisis to force the issue, to transition it from a moral question, which Abu Bakr had already answered, into an urgent regulatory necessity.
Okay, so let's fast forward through that missing millennium to the 1950s and 60s. The post-war industrial boom is in full swing.
And while it's creating incredible economic prosperity, it's also creating pollution on a scale humanity had never, ever seen before. This wasn't a local nuisance anymore. This was systemic, widespread contamination.
And the modern regulatory state was, as you said, forged in the fire of these tragedies. These weren't abstract problems. They were visible, they were lethal, and the sources highlight three major global catalysts that finally pushed nations to act.
Let's start with the 1952 Great Smog of London. I think it's hard for us today to really grasp how apocalyptic this event was.
It wasn't just a foggy week.
No, not at all. It was this perfect storm of factors. You had unusually cold weather, so everyone was burning low-grade, sulfur-heavy coal to heat their homes. You had all the industrial emissions from power stations and factories. And then a weather event, a temperature inversion, clamped down on the city like a lid, trapping all of it.
So the air just became toxic soup.
A toxic acidic soup. Visibility dropped to inches in some places. People couldn't see their own feet. But the real horror was the health impact. Thousands died in the immediate weeks from bronchitis, pneumonia, heart failure. The final death toll is estimated to be as high as 12,000 people.
12,000 people. The lesson was just burned into the public consciousness. Unregulated air pollution kills on a mass scale.
And that led directly to the UK's 1956 Clean Air Act, one of the first major pieces of modern environmental law.
Okay, let's move across the Atlantic. We have what might be the most infamous environmental image of the 20th century, the Cuyahoga River fire in 1969.
That image, a river literally on fire, is just the perfect, horrifying symbol of industrial neglect. The river, which runs through Cleveland, Ohio, was basically an open sewer. It was saturated with oil, chemical solvents, industrial waste. It was flammable.
And this wasn't even the first time it caught fire, right?
Not even close. It had caught fire more than a dozen times before. But the 1969 fire happened at the right moment. It got national attention. It was featured in Time magazine, and it became this rallying cry. It proved that water contamination destroys communities and can turn vital natural systems into combustible hazards.
And that event was just pivotal in mobilizing public opinion and giving politicians the cover they needed to create the EPA.
Without a doubt.
And the third major catalyst, a truly horrifying example of long-term poisoning, comes from Japan. The Minamata mercury disaster.
This was a different kind of tragedy. Not a sudden event, but a slow, insidious poisoning over decades. A company, Chiso Corporation, was dumping methyl mercury, a highly toxic industrial byproduct, directly into Minamata Bay.
And this was a coastal community that relied on fishing.
Entirely. The mercury accumulated in the fish and shellfish, and then in the people who ate them. It caused a severe neurological syndrome, now called Minamata disease, uncontrollable tremors, paralysis, insanity, and horrific birth defects in children.
It was, in effect, a kind of slow-motion chemical warfare against a vulnerable population.
It was, and it demonstrated that toxic waste leads to community destruction that can echo for generations.
So these three events, and many others like them, proved it. Environmental neglect eventually becomes a national tragedy, which means it requires a national response.
And the birth of the modern regulatory state followed very quickly after that. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency was established in 1970. You get the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act.
The European Union starts creating its environmental directives. The UN Environment Program is formed to push for global cooperation.
It was a global awakening, born of crisis.
So here's where we connect it back. The 7th century code had that simple, powerful command, do not cut trees. How do these huge, complex, legalistic 20th century regulatory agencies enforce that same ancient principle today?
They do it by translating that moral duty into what's called command and control law. So do not cut trees becomes a whole suite of detailed statutes. It becomes deforestation bans that require permits for logging. It becomes wetlands protection acts that prohibit draining swamps.
Or endangered species acts that protect the critical habitats where those trees grow.
Exactly. And the ban on burning crops or damaging the earth, that's reflected in incredibly complex regulations like the clean air laws that put emission controls on cars and factories, or the Clean Water Act that polices what industries can discharge into rivers.
But the most profound parallel, I think, to Abu Bakr's whole idea of pre-harm accountability is the modern process of the Environmental Impact Assessment, or EIA.
Yes. The EIA is the modern equivalent of asking for permission before you potentially punish the innocent earth. It is a game changer.
Let's spend a minute on that because this is where the technical, bureaucratic process really meets the old philosophical intent. How does an EIA actually enforce this idea of a public trust?
Okay, so an EIA is a mandatory procedure for any major project. Think a new highway, a power plant, a massive factory. It legally requires the developers to study and forecast the ecological and social consequences of their project before they're allowed to break ground.
So it forces transparency.
Transparency and analysis. It usually has three core stages. First is screening, which just determines if a project is big enough to even need an EIA. Second is scoping, where they define the boundaries of the study. Are we looking at air pollution, water quality, wildlife displacement, noise, social health?
All of the above, usually.
Right. And then comes the big one, the impact analysis itself, along with a mitigation proposal. The developer has to detail the potential harm and then propose concrete ways to avoid or reduce that harm.
And if the harm is too great,
Then the project can be denied a permit, or the government can force them to make major changes to the plan. It enforces that principle of stewardship. It says your economic goal does not automatically justify the environmental cost. You have to prove that the public trust, the ecosystem, won't be irreparably damaged.
it's a systematic way to hold power accountable. It's the modern bureaucratic version of the caliph's rebuke to his commander.
The philosophical echo is just undeniable. The modern world finally, after centuries and immense suffering, arrived at the same conclusion. Nature is not property. It is a trust.
The big difference is that in the 20th century, we needed the force of scientific data, regulatory agencies, and armies of lawyers to impose this truth on a global industrial system that had largely forgotten it.
A system that had rejected that ethical framework for 1,300 years.
And this global regulatory framework then had to be interpreted and integrated into the national laws of individual countries. Which brings us to our third and final stop, the landmark Shehla Zia case in Pakistan, where those ancient ethical principles have very, very deep roots.
And this is where we shift from regulatory law, which can sometimes be flexible or change with politics, to constitutional law.
Which is the bedrock, the unassailable baseline of citizen rights. Moving the environment into the Constitution means it can't just be rolled back by the next administration.
It becomes a fundamental human right.
So let's get into the specifics of this Pakistani Supreme Court judgment from 1994. The case is Shehla Zia versus WAPDA.
And the situation is a classic environmental conflict. It's happening in Islamabad, the capital. A group of citizens challenged the state-run Water and Power Development Authority. That's WAPDA.
And what were they challenging?
WAPDA was building a high-voltage grid station right near a residential neighborhood. And the residents were terrified. Their fears were very practical and immediate. Noise pollution, physical hazards from the high power lines, and crucially, the potential long-term health effects of living in a strong electromagnetic field.
This is a classic David and Goliath scenario. You have a massive state infrastructure project deemed essential for national development.
Right. WAPDA's argument was basically, look, the nation needs electricity. This is critical infrastructure. The country's development has to come before these localized health concerns.
A very common argument.
Very common. But the Supreme Court, in what can only be described as a powerful act of judicial activism, refused to see it that way. They took a much, much broader view than just, measuring radiation levels.
And what did they rule?
The landmark ruling delivered this dramatic foundational expansion of rights. The court held that, and this is the core quote, "The right to life under Article 9 includes the right to a clean and healthy environment."
That one sentence, that's the moment the entire legal landscape shifts.
Tectonic plates, right there. By directly linking the environment to Article 9 of the Constitution, the fundamental right to life, the court was saying that a degraded environment is a direct threat to life itself.
So the environment is no longer just a nice thing to have or something to be managed by an agency. It's a prerequisite for human existence and dignity.
Its significance is impossible to overstate. This ruling became the foundational doctrine, the bedrock of all Pakistani environmental law that followed. It has been cited as the binding authority in dozens of later cases.
It legally created this trinity: environment equals life equals dignity. If you pollute the air, the water, or the land, you are fundamentally violating the life and dignity of the people who live there.
And what makes this case so perfect for our deep dive today is that the court didn't just rely on modern constitutional theory from, say, the US or Europe. They explicitly grounded their modern ruling in ancient Islamic legal tradition.
They built a bridge between the two worlds.
A critical synthesis. The court connected its interpretation of Article 9 all the way back to a very old, very well-established Islamic legal principle, a maxim that informs much of civil law. No harm, no harassment. La darar wa la dirar.
This is a crucial concept. We have to break this down. La darar wa la dirar. What does that actually mean, and how is it normally used in law?
So it's a foundational maxim in Islamic jurisprudence. You see it a lot in cases about property, torts, disputes between neighbors. Darar refers to causing injury or harm, and dirar refers to reciprocating that harm or just acting in a vexatious way.
So it's basically a prohibition on both starting harm and retaliating with more harm.
That's a great way to put it. A simple traditional example would be, if my neighbor builds a wall so high that it blocks all sunlight from my garden, that's dar. He's harming me. If I then retaliate by diverting my sewage onto his property, that's dar. The principle is about maintaining social balance.
It's the idea that you can't exercise your own rights in a way that maliciously or fundamentally harms the rights and health of your neighbors or the community.
Precisely. And what the Supreme Court did in Shehla Zia was brilliant. They took this principle that's normally applied to disputes between two houses and applied it to the entire constitutional relationship between the state and its citizens.
They said that WAPDA building the grid station with its risk of electromagnetic harm was an act of dar against the whole residential community.
Yes. And because the Constitution guarantees the right to life, the state itself has a duty, under this ancient maxim of ladar, not to permit or cause that kind of harm. This fusion, merging the long-standing Islamic ethics with modern constitutional rights, is what gave environmental protection its highest possible legal status in the country.
And the sources also mention Article 14 of the Constitution, which protects the dignity of man. That also played a role.
It did, because the link to dignity is key. The court recognized that living under the constant threat of toxic exposure, or in a severely degraded ecosystem, strips away your human dignity. A truly dignified life requires a safe, clean place to live.
So the implication here for you listening is really transformative. This case shows how any legal system, whether it's based on secular common law or religiously rooted ethics, has the tools within it, like the right to life, the right to dignity, to elevate the environment from just a regulatory issue to an unalienable right.
It's the ultimate culmination. From a 7th century moral rule to a 20th century regulatory rule, and now finally a constitutional rule.
Which means it's time to bring all three together and really analyze how they align and where they differ.
This is the moment, connecting the dots across 1,300 years.
Okay, we're comparing a military order from the 7th century, a global regulatory movement from the 20th, and a constitutional ruling from 1994. The facts that their core conclusions line up is, frankly, astonishing.
Let's do a direct comparison across 4 key areas the sources identify. We'll start with the most basic, the action prohibited by each system.
Okay, so in the Islamic era, with Abu Bakr, the prohibition is very specific. It's about military destruction. Don't cut trees, don't burn crops.
Right. Then you jump to modern global law, the EPAs.
Mhm.
The prohibition becomes much broader. It's against systemic, large-scale industrial activities, pollution, toxic discharge, uncontrolled deforestation.
And then in Pakistan, with the Shehla Zia case, the prohibited action is any activity at all, public or private, that threatens the constitutional right to life through environmental damage. The target gets wider and wider, but the core intent is the same. Stop the degradation of the systems that support life.
Exactly. Now let's look at the root of ethics. This is where they look different on the surface, but are philosophically linked. Why did each system protect the environment?
For the Islamic era, it's clearly rooted in the idea of divine trust, amana. Humans are stewards, they're not owners. They have a duty to care for creation.
For modern global law, the foundation is, totally secular and pragmatic. It's health and safety. Regulations exist because we have the data that proves uncontrolled industry is lethal, it's expensive, and it destabilizes society.
And for Pakistan, the root is constitutional protection. The environment is protected simply because the Constitution says life and dignity are paramount, and a clean environment is part of that.
And here's where I want to pause for a second.
Hmm.
The gap between divine trust and secular health and safety seems huge. Doesn't the health and safety model mean the environment only gets protected after we can prove it's harming humans?
That's a fantastic point. It seems like the ancient model gives the environment intrinsic value. It's innocent, it's a trust, it should be protected, period.
Whereas the modern regulatory model, at least in its early days, was very anthropocentric, human-centered. We protect the environment because we need clean air to breathe and clean water to drink.
But the Shehla Zia ruling kind of bridges that gap, doesn't it? By using the constitutional right to life, a secular concept, but grounding it in the ethical principle of la dara wa la diyar, the court gave its ruling a higher moral authority that goes beyond just calculating risk levels.
A perfect synthesis. Okay, let's move to the third point, accountability and enforcement. How did these systems make sure people follow the rules?
In the Islamic era, it was very direct. It was accountability for harm enforced by the highest moral and military authority, the caliph's sharp rebuke and disciplinary action.
Modern global law relies on a vast, expensive, and often slow bureaucracy. Fines, forced shutdowns, and criminal penalties enforced by specialized agencies like the EPA. Compliance is driven by fear of financial and legal pain.
But Pakistan's court introduced a third, really powerful mechanism: judicial activism. It empowered citizens to bypass the slow agencies and appeal directly to the Supreme Court to defend their fundamental rights.
Which is incredibly effective. It makes environmental protection an immediate, defensible right that you have as a citizen, not just another regulatory hurdle for a corporation.
Okay, last point of comparison. The overriding priority. In each era, what was deemed more important than environmental protection? Or rather, what did environmental protection override?
In the Islamic era, the priority was clearly public welfare over short-term military or economic gain. Burning a palm grove might help win a battle, but it violated the ethical trust, so it was forbidden.
For modern global law, the constant battle is to prioritize sustainability over uncontrolled industrial growth. The very existence of EPAs is an admission that we have to balance long-term ecological health against short-term profit.
And in Pakistan, the Shehla Zia precedent means the constitutional guarantee of a healthy environment must take precedence over corporate convenience or even national infrastructure plans if they pose a significant health threat. The right to a clean environment trumps the efficiency of WAPDA's construction schedule.
So when you lay it all out like that, this systematic comparison leads us to this one unified conclusion: the fundamental legal truth that all three frameworks arrived at, despite their different paths.
And that unified conclusion, spanning 13 centuries, is this: protection of the environment is protection of humanity. Environmental harm is a violation of life and dignity.
That single sentence really encapsulates this entire deep dive. It shows the moral imperative was always there right from the beginning, but it took global disasters and incredible judicial bravery to actually enforce it on a global scale.
It creates this beautiful, clear chain of justice. Abu Bakr established the code based on divine trust.
The modern world built regulatory EPAs based on empirical tragedy.
And the Pakistani Supreme Court declared a clean environment a fundamental constitutional right by weaving ancient ethics and modern law together.
You know, this whole conversation, it really challenges our modern notion of progress. We tend to assume that because we have more technology, our ethical understanding must also be more advanced.
But the sources show that the core moral lesson, the concept of public trust, of stewardship, was understood perfectly well in the 7th century. The failure wasn't a moral failure.
It was a failure of scalability. a failure to apply that morality against the overwhelming force of industrialization. We needed our public health systems to collapse, to legally mandate what one leader once enforced with ethical discipline alone.
It connects back to that enduring lesson. A just society protects its people, but a truly great society protects the planet that's been entrusted to it.
It's just the whole conversation. It's not just about complying with the latest regulation. It's about fulfilling a fundamental moral duty.
A duty of stewardship.
So we've traced this remarkable legal and ethical journey today, and I think our three major takeaways are crystal clear. First, the existence of that detailed 7th century environmental code based on the idea of a public trust.
Second, the tragic, crisis-driven necessity that forced the creation of modern EPAs all over the world.
And third, that groundbreaking judicial leap in Pakistan that finally enshrined a clean environment as a fundamental constitutional right to life.
This whole exploration just proves that ethics come before the law. And that tragedy, unfortunately, is often what it takes to accelerate the enforcement. Every system we looked at, military, regulatory, constitutional, eventually had to conclude that ecological integrity is non-negotiable for human survival and dignity.
And we really have to thank you, our listener, for bringing this incredible stack of sources to us. It allowed for such a deep, comparative exploration of law, history, and ethics, and it completely forced us to rethink the timeline of environmentalism itself.
It's a necessary corrective, I think. It ensures that these non-Western, non-secular traditions get the credit they deserve for their early and profound commitment to stewardship.
And as always, we want to leave you with that one final provocative thought from the source material, a maxim that should really inform every single environmental debate we have today. The Earth is not inherited from our ancestors. It is borrowed from our children.
That phrase, it just reframes everything. It imposes the debt of intergenerational equity. If you see the Earth as a debt you owe, not a gift you received, then stewardship becomes an absolute moral and legal duty.
Which raises an important question for you to think about. How can you apply these ancient concepts of trust, of public welfare, that principle of la dar wa la dirar, no harm to the environmental debates happening in your own community right now?
Are we in our own lives and societies upholding that public trust? Or are we, in our own way, still punishing the innocent Earth?
Something to think about until the next deep dive. Thanks for listening.
Catch you next time.